I was driving back from an early shift along the frozen edge of the harbor when I saw what I first thought was a torn grocery bag stuck against the guardrail. The wind was sharp, carrying that metallic smell of salt and diesel from the fishing boats. I almost kept going until the bag moved. I slowed, my breath catching as I saw a small shape trembling, half covered in gray slush. It wasn't trash, it was a puppy. He was no more than 5 months old, a white Labrador retriever, though his coat was the color of dirty snow now, matted, wet, and streaked with grime. His ribs showed when he tried to lift his head. I remember the sound of the ice cracking under my boots as I stepped toward him, whispering just to keep my own voice steady. Hey, it's okay. He didn't move, just stared with wide, glassy eyes that looked too old for his face. The city around us didn't stop. Cars passed, tires hissing on slush. People hurried by with collars turned up against the cold. No one looked down. I took off my gloves, wrapped my hands around his shaking body, and felt the terrifying lightness, like lifting nothing. His breath came in short, uneven bursts that fogged against my wrist. When I carried him into my truck, his paw left a wet print on my sleeve. I remember that mark more than anything. It was proof he was still here. I turned the heater up and watched him curl tighter on the seat, as if the warmth itself was foreign. I didn't know yet what he'd been through, but I knew I couldn't drive away. He didn't move for the first 10 minutes. The heater hummed, and the smell of wet fur filled the cab, an awful mix of salt, grime, and something sour, like metal and fear. I kept glancing over, afraid he'd stop breathing. His eyes were half closed, but when the truck hit a bump, one paw twitched, and that tiny motion felt like hope. My name's Alex. I work maintenance at the docks, fixing broken nets, patching engines. I've seen all kinds of things wash up along this coast, but never something so alive and fragile at the same time. I talked to him just to keep the silence from swallowing us both. You're safe now, buddy. We'll get you warm, I promise. At the first red light, I reached over with my coat and wrapped him tighter. His fur was soaked through, cold as ice. Beneath it, I could feel every bone. When I touched his side, he gave a faint sound, half whimper, half sigh, and pressed his nose weakly against my wrist. That was the moment I realized he still wanted to live. I stopped by the small animal clinic on Water Street. The snow had turned to freezing rain, clicking against the windshield. I ran inside, shouting for help before I even hit the counter. The nurse looked up, startled, and then her eyes softened when she saw what I was holding. She grabbed a blanket, and we hurried him into the back. As the door swung closed behind me, I heard them call for warm IV fluids. My hands were still shaking. I stood there, dripping onto the tile floor, praying he'd make it through the next hour. The clinic smelled of disinfectant and wet wool, that sharp, clean scent that never quite hides the fear underneath. They laid him on a metal table under a heat lamp, and steam rose from his fur as the ice melted. His white coat turned patchy gray, and every rib stood out like piano keys beneath his skin. The vet, Dr. Patel, didn't say much at first, just moved quickly, checking his pulse, his gums, his temperature. Severe hypothermia. Malnourished, she murmured, threading a thin IV into his leg. I stood there useless, clutching my wet coat, my fingers still trembling from the cold. She asked if he had a name. I shook my head. Found him by the harbor. My voice cracked on the word found. He lay motionless, except for the slow rise of his chest. Every breath seemed like a small fight. They wrapped him in towels warmed by the dryer, tucked a blanket around him, and placed a small heating pad beneath. The nurse dabbed his paws gently with gauze, cleaning away salt and grime until the pink pads showed through again. I stayed in the corner, watching the tiny movements, the flicker of his eyelid, the soft twitch of his ear. Outside, the wind battered the windows, but here it was silent except for the rhythmic beep of the monitor. When his eyes opened for a second, hazy and unfocused, I whispered, "You're not alone anymore, okay?" His gaze met mine just long enough to make my chest tighten. For the first time since I'd found him, he didn't look afraid, just tired. I sat down on the cold floor beside the table and promised quietly, "I'll be here when you wake up." He made it through the night. I didn't sleep. The metal chair beside his kennel dug into my back, but I couldn't leave. Every few minutes, his breathing would stutter, then steady again, and I'd find myself counting. 1, 2, 3, just to make sure he was still fighting. The storm outside had passed by dawn, leaving the city glazed in ice. Sunlight spilled through the frosted windows, catching on his damp fur. For the first time, I saw a hint of what color it was meant to be, pure white, soft beneath the tangles. Dr. Patel came in with a cup of coffee and a quiet smile. "He's lucky you found him when you did. Another hour, and he wouldn't have made it." She asked if I wanted to stay while they tried to feed him. I nodded before she'd even finished the question. The nurse filled a syringe with a thin mix of broth and nutrients, easing it between his lips. At first, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, his tongue flicked out, tasting. A single swallow, then another. My heart lifted in my throat. When she stepped away, I reached through the bars and brushed my fingers against his paw. It was still cold, but no longer icy. His eyes fluttered open, still dull, but aware this time. He didn't flinch from my hand. "You're tougher than you look," I whispered. He blinked, slow and deliberate, as if trying to understand. The heat lamps buzzed softly overhead, and for a brief moment, the world outside felt distant. There was just this small creature breathing beside me, and the fragile, impossible sound of hope returning. By the second morning, he could lift his head. It was shaky, slow, but it was his own strength this time, not the wires or warmth keeping him alive. The vet called it progress. I called it a miracle. His fur had started to dry in uneven patches, still stiff with salt, but when the light hit, I could see flashes of white again, like snow trying to reclaim its color. I brought an old wool blanket from my truck, the one I used during winter repairs, and laid it in his kennel. He sniffed it weakly, nose twitching, then rested his chin right on top of it. I laughed under my breath. "Guess that's yours now." Dr. Patel said they'd keep him under observation a few more days, but she looked at me in that knowing way. "You're not planning to leave him here, are you?" I didn't answer right away. I just kept watching him breathe, each exhale fogging the glass a little. "No," I finally said. "Not if he wants to come with me." When I opened the kennel, he tried to crawl closer, dragging himself just a few inches before collapsing again. His tail gave a single, slow wag. It was barely a motion, but it undid me completely. I knelt down beside him, feeling my throat tighten. "You don't owe me anything," I said softly. "But if you want to fight, I'll help you." The nurse smiled quietly from across the room. The machines kept beeping. The world kept moving, but right there, in that small, sterile space, it felt like the beginning of something neither of us could name yet. They let me take him home 3 days later. He was still weak, his steps uncertain, but the vet said fresh air and quiet would help him heal faster. I wrapped him in my jacket and carried him out into the brittle morning light. The snow along the harbor had turned to a crust of ice that crackled under my boots. He squinted against the brightness, nose twitching at every new smell, the salt, the oil from the docks, the faint scent of fish and pine. It was like he was trying to memorize the world again. At home, I set up a spot near the old wood stove with a folded blanket and a shallow bowl of water. He circled twice before lying down, his thin body curling into the warmth. I sat on the floor beside him, listening to the quiet pops of burning wood. For the first time, he didn't tremble when I reached out. He let my hand rest on his side, and his breathing slowed, steady and soft. That night, I caught myself talking to him like an old friend. About the storms, the long nights at the docks, how the sea could turn cruel and kind in the same hour. His eyes followed every word, as if he understood. When I stopped, he gave a tiny sound, almost like an answer. Before turning off the light, I whispered, "You're safe here, little one." His tail brushed the blanket once, slow and deliberate. It wasn't much, but it was the first promise he'd ever trusted me to keep. By the end of the week, he was walking on his own, wobbly at first, like a newborn deer, but determined. Every step seemed to surprise him, as if his legs had forgotten their purpose. I'd leave the door open to let the morning air in, and he'd stand there at the threshold, sniffing the wind before taking those brave, careful steps onto the porch. The sun caught his coat now, still patchy, still thin, but white again. Clean, alive. I started calling him Snow, half joking, half afraid to make it real. But one morning when I said it, his ears perked up and he looked straight at me. That sealed it. "Snow it is," I said, and he wagged his tail as if he'd been waiting all along to hear his name. Feeding time became our ritual. He'd wait by the stove, watching every move, his eyes bright with focus. When I set down the bowl, he'd eat slowly, careful but hungry, pausing only to look up at me between bites. Each meal felt like a small victory over the life he'd been pulled from. The scars along his belly were fading, though his paws still trembled when thunder rolled in from the sea. I'd sit beside him, letting him press his body against my leg until the sound passed. Outside, the ice was melting, water dripping from the eaves. That night, as he fell asleep with his head resting on my boot, I realized the house didn't feel empty anymore. The silence that used to stretch between the walls had turned soft, like the quiet after a storm when the world finally exhales. Spring came slow to the coast, but when it did, the world outside our window turned to silver and blue. Snow had filled out, his ribs no longer sharp, his fur soft and clean now, white again, the way it was meant to be. Sometimes, when he stood in the sunlight, he looked almost glowing. He followed me everywhere, to the docks, to the repair shed, even along the frozen beach where I first found him. He walked close at first, always glancing back to make sure I was near, but with each day, he grew bolder, nose buried in the air, paws splashing through shallow puddles. The first time he broke into a full run, I almost shouted from joy. The wind caught his ears, his tail arched high, and for that brief, perfect moment, there was nothing left of the terrified puppy I'd lifted from the ice. Only life, pure and unguarded. People around the harbor started to notice him. "That your dog, Alex?" they'd ask, smiling as he trotted proudly beside me. I'd nod, every time still a little amazed to say yes. That evening, as we walked home, he stopped suddenly by the water's edge. The tide was low, the rocks gleaming with frost, the same place where I'd first seen him lying motionless. He stood there quietly, staring out to sea. I knelt beside him, and he leaned into my shoulder. Neither of us moved for a long time. The air smelled of salt and thawing earth. The past was still out there somewhere, but it no longer owned him. Not anymore. By early summer, snow had become part of every rhythm of my life. He woke me before sunrise, pawing at the edge of the bed, tail thumping against the floor. We'd walk down to the docks together, the air already heavy with mist and gull cries. He loved the sound of the waves slapping against the pilings, the smell of salt and diesel. Things that used to terrify him now seemed to remind him he'd survived. He was strong now. When he ran, his muscles moved beneath that bright white coat, sleek and alive. The locals joked that he looked like a ghost sprinting along the shore. Sometimes he'd stop mid-run, glance back at me, and bark once, a short, confident sound that felt like laughter. One afternoon, I took him out on my small fishing boat. He stood at the bow, nose high, ears flicking in the wind. For a moment, I saw the same look he'd had that first day, focused, searching, but now there was no fear, only curiosity. He turned to me, tongue lolling, eyes bright, and I swear I could see gratitude there, wordless but clear as sunlight on water. That night, when we came home, he lay on the floor beside the stove, head resting on my boot just like before. Only this time, it wasn't out of fear or weakness. It was comfort, belonging. As I stroked his fur, I realized something simple and profound. I may have pulled him from the cold that morning by the harbor, but in ways I couldn't explain, he'd been the one who brought me back to life. The first snow of the next winter came early, soft, steady flakes that turned the harbor white again. I stood by the window with a mug of coffee, watching as snow bounded through the yard, his fur blending perfectly with the falling flakes. He'd grown into a strong, graceful Labrador, the kind of dog that made people stop and smile without knowing why. Every leap, every joyful spin, felt like a quiet rebellion against the world that had once tried to break him. Sometimes I still saw flashes of that fragile puppy in him, when thunder cracked or when the wind howled the way it had that night I found him. But instead of freezing, he'd come to me, pressing his body against my leg until the sound passed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was trust. I took him back to the harbor that afternoon. The sea was half frozen, the same dull gray it had been that morning months ago. Snow walked ahead, nose to the wind, confident and unhurried. When we reached the spot by the guardrail, he stopped and looked up at me, tail wagging slow and steady. I crouched beside him, my glove brushing the scar that still traced his neck like a faint memory. "You remember, don't you?" I whispered. He leaned into my chest, eyes half closed, the warmth of his breath fogging in the cold air. The city hummed quietly behind us, boats creaking, gulls calling, but it all felt distant. I rested my forehead against his and felt that same heartbeat I'd once been afraid would stop. He had lived. More than that, he'd healed. And in saving him, somewhere along the way, I'd learned how to heal too.